Michael jetzt schnell umschalten.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 7th evening of our K Universale lecture series on the question of solidarity, concepts, controversies, perspectives. My name is Kerstin Schmidt. I am Professor of American Studies at the Catholic University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt, and together with my colleague from sociology, Joost van Loon, I'm responsible for this series. The K Universale lecture series takes place every fall term, always with a different topic. It is actually directed at students from various disciplines and will bring them together, but it is also open to the public in an effort to reach out of the ivory tower and to connect. While most lectures will be in German, tonight's talk, along with 4 others during the term, will be in English, which is why my short introduction is in English as well. I would like to point out that in order to make tonight's talk possible, we have collaborated with the Bavarian American Academy in Munich. So thanks to the BAA for their generous support. We started the lecture series on November 9th with an official kickoff event with Wolfgang Benz, longtime director of the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technical University Berlin. He talked about solidarity, mostly the lack thereof, during the Reichskristallnacht on November 9th. Then our guest was Klaus Dörre from the University of Jena. He talked about what he calls exclusive solidarity in the labor movement and in labor unions. Nicole Schneider of our own American Studies Department analyzed forms of visual protest with regard to the movement for Black lives. Frank Adloff out of Hamburg sketched ways to practice solidarity with non-human life. And Amin Nasehi of Munich's LMU talked about the nature of protest itself. All talks are still available on KU's YouTube channel. This is perhaps among the very few benefits that virtual life under the dictate of the virus has in store. Tonight's talk is located at the intersection of feminist theory and practice, anti-racist and anti-capitalist endeavor, with respect to a very peculiar location, namely that of the border and that of the bridge. Examples of all decisive border practices in the talk will come from heavily contested, in fact, tragic geopolitical border occupations. India, Kashmir, Israel, Palestine, and the US and Mexico. These are heavily mediatized border regions. And this morning, as I was preparing for tonight's lecture, I couldn't help thinking what a timely topic we have, and how the pandemic has become an additional severe force in border practices. The morning news informed us all of the closing of borders as we speak. This morning, it was rather about a tunnel than a bridge, as well as waterways, air travel to and from Britain. But the virus and the way it has been handled not only lastingly affected border practices, it has also shuttled us back with regard to feminist and equal opportunity practice, as it once more corroborated a deep-rooted and more than tacit understanding that when push comes to shove, it is women who take care of care responsibilities, as care facilities for the elderly or for the young are closed. By the same token, it is so-called minorities and women who are faced with most serious repercussions of the pandemic and who have had to cope with significant blows to equal rights and social justice. Since we are in education, and on top, we train future teachers, it is all the more important to draw attention, to provide knowledge, to foster critical and dedicated discussion. These are trying times, which demand both kindness and courage to large and maybe to extraordinary degrees. So in many ways, this evening is also a call to stand in solidarity with everyone working towards equal rights and racial justice, both North and South, Western and non-Western, first and third worlds, 1/3 and 2/3 worlds. In order to do the job of educating us further, we invite people over to talk about their research on the promising, but also complex topic of solidarity from a variety of perspectives. It is my particular pleasure to introduce to you tonight's speaker. Chandra Talpade Mohanty is Distinguished Professor of Women's and Gender Studies, Sociology, and the Cultural Foundation of Education, as well as Dean's Professor of the Humanities at Syracuse University. As a scholar and activist, a post-colonial and transnational feminist theorist, she has argued for the inclusion of a transnational approach in exploring women's experiences across the world. Her work focuses on transnational feminist theory, anti-capitalist feminist praxis, anti-racist education, and the politics of knowledge. Central to Chandra Mohanty's transnational mission is the project of building a, and here I quote, non-colonizing feminist solidarity across the borders. And she aims to do that through an intersectional analysis of race, nation, colonialism, sexuality, class, and gender, which is one of the many reasons why she is the perfect speaker for our series. Chandra Mohanty is the author of Feminism Without Borders, Decolonizing Theory, Practicing Solidarity. That book came out with Duke University Press in 2003 and with Zuban Books in India 2004. It's been translated into a series of languages: Korean, Swedish, Turkish, Japanese, Italian, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were more. She's also co-editor of Third World Women and the Politics of Feminism, came out with Indiana University Press, Feminist Genealogies, Colonial Legacies, Democratic Futures, published by Routledge, Feminism and War, Confronting U.S. Imperialism by Zed Press, and the Sage Handbook on Identities, co-edited with Margaret Wetherell in 2010. Chandra Mohanty graduated with honors and the bachelor's degree in English from the University of Delhi in India. She continued her education, attended the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, from where she earned a master's degree in education, specifically in teaching English in 1980. Following her master's, she completed a PhD from the same university in 1987. She's additionally the recipient of an honorary doctorate from Lund University in Sweden and an honorary doctorate in humanities from the College of Wooster, Ohio. As of 2013, she has served as the Women's Studies Department Chair at Syracuse University. She is a member of the advisory boards of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, or of the Center for Intersectional Justice, and she's on the board of the following journals: Science, Journal of Women and Cultural Technology, Transformations, the Journal of Inclusive Pedagogy and Scholarship, Feminist Africa, Asian Women, Feminist Economics, and the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies. She became very widely known after the publication of her 1986 essay, Under Western Eyes, Feminist Scholarship and Colonial Discourses. This essay made a difference to a great number of people, and it definitely changed, radically changed, the perspective of one young and somewhat naive graduate student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the mid-90s. And that student was myself. I vividly remember reading the essay in class and what feminism meant and how I, as a white European woman, was implicated in it simply wasn't the same after. My own self-righteous, adamant, and dedicated vision of feminist practice and thought, my own Western eye, needed some substantial reorientation. That much was for sure. In this essay, she states the relationship between woman with a capital W, a cultural and ideological composite other constructed through diverse representational discourses, scientific, literary, juridical, linguistic, cinematic, etc., and women, plural and lowercase w, real, material, subject of their collective histories, is one of the central questions the practice of feminist scholarship seeks to address. End of quote. In this essay, she critiques the political project of Western feminism and its discursive construction of the category of the third world woman as a generic, homogeneous, victimized stereotype. She states that Western feminisms have tended to gloss over the differences between Southern women, but that the experience of oppression is incredibly diverse and contingent upon historical, cultural, and individual reasons. Her paper has been a key work highlighting the difficulties faced by feminists from the third world in being heard within the broader feminist movement. It led to a redefining of power relationships between feminists within the first and third worlds, or in more recent terms, between 1/3 and the 2/3 worlds. In 2003, Chandra Mohanty released her book, Feminism Without Borders, Decolonizing Theory, Practicing Solidarity. And I think you can see it on the shelf behind my back. In this work, she argues for a bridging of theory and praxis and the personal and the political. Major themes addressed include the politics of difference, transnational solidarity building, and anti-capitalist struggle against neoliberal globalization. As well as reprinting under Western eyes in the final section, she offers a response to criticism of that very essay and reiterates her belief in the possibility, indeed necessity, she writes, of building common political projects between third world and Western feminisms. To my knowledge, the last book to be published is Feminist Freedom Warriors, Genealogies, Justice, Politics, and Hope. That is a book you should also see behind my back on the shelves. It was published in 2018 by Haymarket Books, and it was co-edited with Linda E. Carty. This book assembles conversations that the two editors have had with sister comrades such as Angela Y. Davis or Himani Banerjee. It grows out of an ongoing digital archive project called Feminist Freedom Warriors that was begun in 2015. And if you punch in feministfreedomwarriors.org, you'll find it. It's a genealogy that wasn't there before. It's educational. It attributes to organizing and to community building as well. Our current pandemic safety measures prescribe that we cannot have an audience or even meet in person. But as always, there is a chance to submit questions during or directly after the talk via KU's Facebook channel or via Vimeo for K Universale students. Questions will be forwarded to me, and I'll ask them for you, at least as many as possible. I promise I will do my best. Chandra's title is Borders and Bridges, Militarized Regimes, Anti-Racist Struggles, and Insurgent Feminist Praxis. I'm very much looking forward to your talk, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you for that lovely long introduction that I now have to live up to. And I'm really delighted to join you and all colleagues and students at KU. I have a rather long and involved argument that I want to make. So I'm going to leap right into it. I want to say, though, that this talk talk is a shorter version of a much longer piece. And so people who are interested in the longer piece, it'll be coming out sometime in 2021, and I'm happy to share it when it's out, okay? So the talk is called Borders and Bridges, Militarized Regimes, Anti-Racist Struggles, and Insurgent Feminist Praxis. I want to begin with a little quote from Gloria Anzaldúa, Chicana feminist. And this is what she said. She said this in 1981, quote, "Voyager, there are no bridges. One builds them as one walks," end of quote. So I want to begin with 3 theoretical and political points that are key to thinking about militarized regimes, anti-racist struggles, and insurgent feminist praxis in times of pandemic and protest. I've begun to think about this moment as not just a moment of pandemic. I can't separate it from protest. So that's how I like to talk about it, pandemic and protest. So the 3 points I'm going to make, and my talk kind of moves between these 3. The first one is border crossings. The second one is interconnected histories. And the third one is intersectional social movements and ethical solidarities. So quite simply, an insurgent feminist lens requires understanding that racialized gender is key to mapping borders, histories, and movements, and asking the question, how and why do women, queer, and gender non-conforming people matter in understanding and responding to this moment of global pandemic and protest? Undergirding all of my scholarly work are my activist commitments to building radical, anti-racist, transnational feminist communities in all of the spaces that I've lived in over 4+ decades of living in the US. None of this work would be possible without these dissident communities. And actually, the Feminist Freedom Warrior Archive is a tribute to these communities that I feel have really sustained me and my thinking and everyday life and activism. And this is, I think, key to living an insurgent life as an anti-racist, anti-imperialist feminist in these times. Building and sustaining these intellectual neighborhoods, as Toni Morrison called them, and communities of dissent inspire and can sustain an insurgent feminist life. Okay, so moving to borders. Our commonsensical understanding of geopolitical borders, that is national, regional, or local, often involves militarized security forces to protect insiders and keep out outsiders or invaders. COVID-19 illustrates that borders cannot be shut down to keep the virus out. In fact, national quarantines are not safe for folks in prison, in detention centers, in slums, and in the US and Europe for Black and brown communities subject to police violence. The pandemic recalls a discourse of disease as invaders. A virus is invasive just as outsiders, right? Immigrants, refugees, so-called potential criminals or terrorists are invaders. So borders have to be policed and protected. And here, think about India, Pakistan, Kashmir, Israel, Palestine, and the US-Mexico border, all of which are heavily militarized spaces. Of course, the pandemic has also shown us that these borders are arbitrary and largely irrelevant. Okay. In fact, the question of borders and citizenship is itself a contested one across the globe. National borders no longer represent a finite geographical space at the edge of the nation. They seep into the nation and determine citizenship for everyone. For instance, Since 1953, the US legally expanded the jurisdiction of border security forces to 100 miles of all borders of the US. This then was 2/3 of the entire population of the US, right? 200 million. So 2/3 of the entire population of the US live in this geographical area, right? But it's called border security, but their jurisdiction is in fact over 2/3 of the US population, right? Also, the European Union has virtual borders in countries like Syria and Iraq, where refugees have to pass border control before leaving for Europe, right? So over the last 50 years of neoliberal capitalism, all investment in social goods and public services has been withdrawn and reinvested in the social control of particular populations, in part by policing borders. At this time then, governance policies target particular populations globally, inside and outside the borders of nation states, and create disparate and unequal citizenship projects. In the US, Trump's 2016 Muslim ban cannot be understood purely as domestic or national policy. Similarly, immigration, refugee, and asylum policies in Europe and elsewhere don't fall neatly into national divisions if we are attentive to the history of colonialism and imperialism. So, in the US, the so-called Muslim ban, the building of the wall at the US-Mexico border, the prison industrial complex, deportation policies, right? All of these primarily in the name of the security of the white nation are in fact connected to state control and violence against Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies. And these policies are all linked to histories of systemic and gendered racism and whiteness, to an ideological and political framework anchored in legacies of settler colonialism and empire, of slavery and indentured labor. These are governance practices of white supremacist patriarchy that create insiders and outsiders, citizens and non-citizens, us and them. In India, the analogy would be Brahminical supremacist patriarchy and Islamophobia that constitute the ruling practices of Narendra Modi's government, criminalizing, incarcerating, and killing Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims in the name of a Hindu Rashtra or homeland. Okay, moving on quickly to histories and movements. My second point. Interconnected historical analysis is key to figuring out how to respond to the global social inequities and violence that the pandemic has laid bare. Histories of colonialism, imperialism, slavery, and migration are interconnected and cross geopolitical borders. Indeed, they can lead to building bridges of solidarity across social justice movements in different geographical spaces, just as the most compelling collaborations and solidarities across national borders have actually been among scientists who share data towards the common purpose of learning about and finding a solution, and now a vaccine to the spread of COVID-19. So neoliberal militarized governance structures create explicitly carceral regimes, geopolitical climate destruction, the massive displacement of people worldwide. We now have war, climate, and economic refugees. And they create the proliferation of racist, corporatist, misogynist ideologies and practices. And not to mention the rise of proto-fascist, masculinist authoritarian regimes like that of Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, etc. So transnational feminist work involves thinking historically, comparatively, and relationally. And it fundamentally involves addressing cartographies of power and difference. I find the geographer Cindy Katz's notion of a counter topography to understand transnational connections very compelling. Katz says, quote, "Not all places affected by capital's global ambition are impacted the same way, and not all issues matter equally everywhere. By constructing precise topographies at a range of scales from the local to the regional and beyond, we can analyze a particular issue, say de-skilling, in and across place, mapping sites connected along this contour line," end of quote. This kind of analysis then, weaving disparate and unequal places, peoples, and histories together, is key to ethical solidarity building across borders. Protest movements then also have to be intersectional, not single issue. And a lot of the current protests, I think, illustrate this. The Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black lives after the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, so on, focus on the issues of multiple levels of US state violence in the targeting of Black, queer, trans, and disabled bodies, explicitly widening the lens of state violence to include those who have been marginalized in Black liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s. This analytic framing emerges from the lived experience and epistemic spaces of Black, queer, trans, feminist communities. And unlike the civil rights and Black power movements of the 60s and 70s, the BLM and MBL chapters across the US do not operate by identifying charismatic leaders, opting instead for a collective decentralized grassroots politics. This absence of a vanguard, okay, the old left politics, does not mean the absence of a coherent analytic framework. And it is this framing, the analysis of state violence from the epistemological point of view of the most marginalized Black communities, that allows for a capacious and inclusive grassroots politics, right? This focus on state violence and its multi-layered impact on Black communities is at once local, national, and transnational. It involves reading the exercise of power and relations of rule from the positionality of Black, poor, queer, trans, impoverished, and criminalized folks across a range of gender identities, and thus has inspired movements across national borders, especially in Europe and Latin America. Feminist praxis that connects questions of the personal and political, of structures and subjectivities, identity and movements, can thus map a counter topography of state violence as it makes and remakes national borders, citizenship, subjectivities, and identities. Am I going too fast or am I doing okay? Okay, all right. So I'm going to move now to explore very briefly the three militarized regimes and geopolitical sites that we mentioned earlier. The US-Mexico border struggles around immigration and cross-border indigenous rights in the lower Rio Grande Valley in Texas, Israel's rule over the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and India's military rule and occupation of the Kashmir Valley, Jammu and Kashmir, as zones of normalized violence. At these sites, neoliberal and militarized states and imperial practices are often sustained by development, peacekeeping, and humanitarian projects. And thus they illuminate the old and new contours of securitized states that function as imperial democracies. Militarized neoliberal state projects in the US, Israel, and India create and sustain endless wars and border zones of violence, while normalizing incarceration regimes within their domestic landscapes. After 9/11, 2001, in all three geopolitical contexts, the state mobilizes a masculinist, securitized ideology based not on defense of the nation, but on coercion that requires neither participation or consent from its citizens. This gendered ideology is anchored in militarized masculinities, or as some people refer to it as muscular militarism, and in patriarchal ideologies of protection and security that require obedience and consent from citizens. Since the early 1990s, with India's shift to neoliberal economic and political policies, the ties between the US, Israel, and India have been forged through the vision of the regimes in power at that time. Bush and the neoconservatives in the US, Sharon and Likud in Israel, and the BJP or the Hindu right in India. As Rupal Oza suggests, since the early 1990s, this geopolitical triad of the US, Israel, and India share a vision of threat and security based on Islam and Muslims as the common enemy, cemented through close and ongoing economic and military alliances. I'm most interested here in the functioning of the Indian militarized state apparatus in the Kashmir Valley and the way in which it controls and defines identity, community, and subjectivity, especially since 2014 and the rise of the Hindutva state, that is, Narendra Modi comes into power and actively victimizes and dehumanizes Kashmir and domesticates and punishes all forms of dissent. The developments, actually the most recent developments since 2019 around Article 370 and the Citizenship Amendment Act in India have mobilized the entire nation, that is, I'm talking about India now, since August 2019. And since that time, Kashmir is under total lockdown with the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A, which is property rights for permanent citizens only. Those are the articles, they've been abrogated of the Indian Constitution, ending Jammu and Kashmir, the constitutionally guaranteed autonomous status since 1947. There's been a deployment of an additional 38,000 military and paramilitary troops. And this is in addition to the 70,000 troops already there, right? In case people are not familiar with this, Kashmir, the border of India, Kashmir, and Pakistan is the heaviest militarized zone in almost the entire world. 3, the imposition of complete communications blackout and 24-hour curfew. Wireless internet, TV, landline phone connections are disabled and people confined to their own homes in the Kashmir Valley. There's been the arrest and preventive detention of politicians across the spectrum, members of civil society and human rights activists, and the torture of detainees. There's a prohibition of peaceful assembly and use of military forces to suppress protests, resulting in deaths and injuries. And finally, the gagging of journalists and news publications through heavy restrictions and constraints on their reporting. And imagine all of this. So this is what happened in 2019, right? So imagine what this means now in 2020 under pandemic conditions. The same anti-Muslim rhetoric is evident in the current refugee crisis in Europe. We have the Hungarian Prime Minister saying Muslims must be blocked to keep Europe Christian. Europe and European identity is rooted in Christianity, end of quote. We have neo-Nazi attacks on asylum seekers in Germany. Remember, the majority of the refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan are Muslims. And the growth of detention centers or reception centers or camps in Hungary and Turkey. The European neighborhood policy funds Libya, Tunisia, Turkey, Egypt, and Morocco under the framework of, quote, development and reforms, unquote, to operate at buffer zones to turn back the surge of refugees. Refugees are often subject to incarceration in these countries, thus extending the so-called borders of Europe into these buffer zones. And even in Switzerland, the so-called neutral country, right? The narrative of Swissness is as external to post-colonial history and racism, allows it to erase and forget its multiple entanglements, economic, scientific, and otherwise, with the imperial projects of Western European countries, and claim a politics of neutrality while participating fully in Europe's anti-immigration and nativist zeitgeist. I'm thinking here of the tougher asylum laws, a xenophobic political culture, and a policy of segregation and inhumane treatment of asylum seekers. These multiple forms of state violence target dispossessed Black, Brown, and Muslim bodies and are thus front and center for the Black, queer, migrant, and post-colonial feminist struggles in Europe. And of course, we can't forget Trump and his deployment of an us and them language of a securitized state, talking about refusing Muslims entry to the US, holding the government hostage to the building of a wall at the US-Mexico border. Since 2015, a new federal government initiative called CVE, which stands for Countering Violent Extremism, which had a pilot project in Los Angeles, Boston, and Minneapolis, has been underway. This was actually Obama's signature counterterrorism program, based on government and private partnerships, and it provided a veneer of community cooperation, right, to his overall strategies for fighting terrorism, which involved basically monitoring and surveilling Muslim communities. CVE is described as a program that aims to deter US citizens from joining violent extremist groups by bringing community and religious leaders together with law enforcement, health professionals, teachers, and social service employees. In Los Angeles, the US State Counterterrorism Program, in partnership with the Muslim Women's Empowerment Organization, the Los Angeles Police Department, the CIA, and FBI are all partners in the creation of the patriotic Muslim woman who takes on the task of countering violent extremism in their community, thus producing empowered, loyal Muslim women citizens. I'm actually drawing on the research of two feminist colleagues, Aza Basaruddin and Kanum Sheikh, right? And this, what's amazing about their research is the claim that while Muslim women are invisible when we think about how the US talks about terrorists and terrorism, right? In this context, in the context of this program, Countering Violent Extremism, Muslim women and state policies she becomes hypervisible. A Muslim woman becomes hypervisible, right? What's interesting is, of course, that this program was eliminated from the 2018 budget of Trump, because of course, for Trump, he doesn't need this kind of a program, which would pretend that it was a humanitarian program. So we could just go straight out and be, doing what we do. However, while the us and them ideologies of securitized states justify borders, walls, and regimes of incarceration, and more recently, regimes of mass deportation in the name of protection of the homeland, it is the connectivity and commonality of the analysis and vision of justice between peoples across borders that feminists and anti-partition activists have in common that inspires a lot of my own reflections. a comparative analysis of the walls and wars that constitute the securitized regimes and the colonial imperial ventures of the US, India, and Israel reveals the ideological operation of discourses of democracy within overtly militarized, securitized nation states, right? And suggests that the militarization of cultures is deeply linked to neoliberal capitalist values and the normalization of what Zila Eisenstein and Arundhati Roy have both called imperial democracy. I love the coupling of imperial with democracy, because I think it analytically, it gives us a really amazing lens to analyze some of these practices. Needless to say, militarization always involves masculinization and heterosexualization as linked state projects, and neoliberal economic arrangements are predicated on gendered and racialized divisions of labor and constructions of subjectivities. And thus, we do need feminist critique. National security regimes or national security states typically use connected strategies of militarization, criminalization, and incarceration to exercise control over particular populations and thus remake individual subjectivities and public cultures, right? So mass incarceration, right, in the United States is the other side of the coin of mass deportation, right? And mass deportation in this country, in the US, is a gendered and racialized tool of state repression that is often implemented in a time of crisis. So while Black men are the largest group incarcerated in the US, Latino men are the largest group facing deportation. This understanding of mass incarceration is now in the public domain, of course, after Ferguson and the Black Lives Matter movement, as is the now visible history of mass deportation since Obama, right? In the Texas-Mexico borderlands, the West Bank and Gaza, and the Kashmir Valley, dispossession of particular subjects, women, poor, indigenous, migrant, Muslim, etc., involves the social control and legal dispossession, or what some people have called the social death, right? Through justified forms of surveillance and violence at multiple levels. The political economy of securitized states is focused fundamentally on the permanent abandonment of certain captive populations that are marked as threats to the neoliberal order. Here, militarized capitalism, enshrined within securitized states, works in concert with fundamentalist Hindu, Muslim, Zionist, and Christian social movements to produce a surge of reactionary neoliberal gender identities. So for instance, and I'm quoting Kashmiri feminist scholar Kalpana Wilson here, within contemporary Hindutva, virulent Islamophobia, caste supremacism, and patriarchal values are intertwined with a commitment to supporting the interests of neoliberal corporate capital through the intensification of gendered processes of exploitation, displacement, and dispossession. In this context, then, statecraft, economic imperatives, and gendered narratives of patriotism are profoundly intertwined. Okay. In spite of the different histories then of colonialism and imperialism, there is in fact a remarkable similarity in the forms of governmentality exercised by the securitized states of India, Israel, and the US, and now actually even the EU. Recall that the EU response, European Union response to the migrant and refugee crisis is often framed in humanitarian and religious terms, not in terms of justice or democracy or equality of all human beings, and that similar securitized regimes, militarizations, and forms of governmentality are being enacted at border crossings in Europe. the historical responsibility and the role of European governments in causing, precipitating, or helping to find solutions to the conflicts is, in fact, largely absent. Comparing these geopolitical sites allows us to understand the way in which the so-called war on terror and militarized cultures, state violence, and the transformation of civilians into insurgents and illegals through the legal suspension of civil rights is symptomatic of imperial authoritarian democracies at this particular moment. In each context, the sovereignty of the state is predicated on the operation of what activists actually in a lot of these spaces are calling the constitution-free zones at the borders of the nation. So think about that idea, right? And the idea that there is in fact a constitution-free zone, right? Okay. And how that notion of a constitution-free zone actually normalizes and authorizes what is seen as constitutional rights in other spaces for other communities. So the normalized violence against particular bodies, Muslim, female, immigrant, native, Arab, buttresses the discourse of protectionism and citizenship in each country. In each case, we can identify states of exception where the suspension of law is required for the practice of empire, right? In each context, citizenship remains elusive for the inhabitants of these borderlands, and identity is always in question given the existence of checkpoints and I-cards. In these securitized landscapes, identity documents become a form of governance and a part of the state apparatus of surveillance. The process of verifying identity produces what Tobias Kelly calls documented lives, particular forms of subjectivity that are marked by anxiety, uncertainty, and fear. Kelly's work focuses on Palestinians, but a similar argument, I think, can be made in the other contexts. When the very identities of people come under question, when sexual, ethnic, and political violence become normative, as it does in these landscapes, the structure of imperial democracies is laid bare. In fact, the governance practices of securitized regimes is such that security is deeply entangled with citizenship or subjectivation processes. While democratic state projects focus on producing national citizens, in securitized regimes, what is at stake is the opposite, the undoing of the very possibility of citizenship for targeted populations like indigenous and Mexican peasant migrant workers in the US-Mexico borderland, Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, civilians in the Kashmir Valley, and so on. These borderlands constitute shadow communities at the local and territorial margins of the state, places that exist as part of the formal state, but excluded from it, so that the violent realities of everyday life and the legal and extra-legal networks that support them are caught up in layers of invisibility. Thus, this logic of violence, containment, and expulsion produces patterns of social abandonment and death with consequences for both communities targeted as enemies and outsiders, but also, in fact, for the entire political body of rights-bearing citizens, because it draws them or us into the field of state violence. These forms of truncated subjectivity and non-citizenship then are a profound marker of global security landscapes at this particular time. Okay, so I'm now moving towards a conclusion and to talk a little bit more about solidarity. I'm okay with time? Okay. So what does it mean then to decolonize feminism and to envision ethical transnational feminist futures? How do the frameworks and approaches of decoloniality, anti-capitalism, anti-racism, and feminism inform, enhance, contradict, and mutually influence one another? These are urgent and important political and intellectual questions at this time when the rhetoric of transnational has been co-opted on a large scale in neoliberal university settings. Administrators are now transnational since they travel across the globe in search of profitable partnership with universities in other countries, and for international students who can pay for higher education that is no longer available to working class and poor students, for instance, in the US. Academic curricula are also transnational, since study abroad programs now buttress a normative curriculum that supposedly prepares students to compete in a global market. In the US academy then, transnational often becomes a placeholder for business as usual, marked as progressive in the face of a conservative xenophobic backlash. Globalization and transnational knowledge production becomes the new managerial mantra in neoliberal university settings. In addition, the larger geopolitical landscape poses urgent and significant challenges to those of us committed to an anti-capitalist, decolonial feminist praxis. While the old, new, constantly shifting political terrain of Trump and company suggests the consolidation of a white supremacist, ableist, heteropatriarchal, carceral regime with billionaire state managers, the multiple visible and persistent uprisings of communities in resistance is truly extraordinary. I know that hopefully on January 20th, if there is no so-called coup, we will move from this administration. However, I want people to understand that the infrastructure that has been put in place by Trump and company will not disappear on January 20th. Therefore, the struggles on the ground right now are going to have to continue, okay? Since 2016, as many of you know, and the inauguration of Trump, there have been hundreds of documented demonstrations, rallies, boycotts, strikes, in large cities in the country and in large cities and towns, and also abroad, I think. New solidarities have been forged, and feminists of all stripes and colors continue to be in leadership in most of these mobilizations. What lies ahead is the hard work of deepening and consolidating the nascent solidarities that have emerged through these mobilizations, to imagine a decolonized public polity anchored in a horizontal feminist solidarity across borders and divides. So December 8th, just past week, commemorates, or more than just a little over a week ago, commemorates the beginning of the Intifada in Palestine, a struggle that has been ongoing since 1948. I mean, a struggle, Palestinian liberation struggle that has been ongoing since 1948. Similarly, resistance to Indian occupation in Kashmir, which is the most militarized zone in the world, as I said, has been an everyday fact of life since the 1950s. I would argue that we have much to learn from analyzing the resistance politics and collective aspirations of freedom and self-determination across these sites, and that developing these transnational feminist frameworks is in fact key to envisioning solidarities and building bridges across borders. I've always believed that solidarity is an achievement, not something that can be gifted or built easily. In these neoliberal times, solidarity has been commodified and repackaged as charity or consumption, right? So you buy products made by women in impoverished communities to show solidarity with them, or you sign petitions to show solidarity. Doesn't mean this is not important, it just means it's inadequate. A radical vision of connectivity and solidarity requires building ethical, cross-border feminist solidarities that confront neoliberal racism and militarized gender regimes globally. This framing points towards strategies of resistance that can fundamentally transform economic and social inequalities from the ground up, leading to the creation of new political landscapes and visions of solidarity. I firmly believe that, like in the Black Lives Matter, the BLM movement, the Black and migrant feminist organizations in Europe, the indigenous, undocumented, and anti-racist feminist organizations in the US, and Dalit feminists making common cause with Muslims in a Hindu fundamentalist regime in India, it is the everyday experiences of marginalized communities, especially women, queer, and trans, Black, brown, indigenous, and other minoritized folks who so often sustain the networks of daily life that must inform processes of creating radical cross-border visions for economic and gender justice. Radical scholars are made, we are not born, and we are forged within communities and collectives that teach us how to resist the kind of individualized neoliberal seductions and erasures that result in colonized mindsets or despair. This to me is the essence of living an insurgent life. I remember Audre Lorde saying to the 1989 graduating class at Oberlin College, quote, "Remember that the rumor that you cannot fight City Hall is in fact started by City Hall," end of quote. So the way to combat neoliberal and authoritarian cultures and institutions is, one, to always question what appears to be normative within our local sites, and to connect these spaces to larger geopolitical processes of capitalism, racism, sexism, fascism, etc. In other words, to denaturalize and demystify power at many levels. Two, to nurture radical communities of dissent in and outside the institutional spaces that we occupy at any given moment. That is, to refuse the isolation that neoliberal commodified cultures thrive on, and to actively cultivate mentors, guides, and teachers who inspire us. Three, to seek for what Angela Davis often calls unlikely coalitions that encourage us to struggle against injustice of all kinds. And four, to always remember that we are not the first nor the last to engage in oppositional social movements or the hard work of resistance. We stand on the shoulders of many others who came before us. Histories of decolonization, resistance, and revolution are crucial reminders that radical scholarship and activism are legacies we inherit and must claim. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I have so many issues and questions on my little notepad here, and the first questions are here already. I don't know. I want to give myself the privilege of asking the first question.
Of course.
So, I am very interested in your focus on place and place-based insurgency. And I do that, I have to, maybe I should say that, I should explain. We have a research training group for several generations of PhD students on practicing place. Mm-hmm. And we focus on the border specifically, and place not as something given, immutable, like eternal.
Right.
Like it's not the conservative take on place. Could you talk a little bit more about place-based narratives, perspectives, maybe also with regard to your own experience as a feminist scholar activist? Sure.
So I think that I figured out, long time ago, at the beginning of my kind of thinking through feminist praxis, that the communities that I was interested in building and sustaining, the dissident communities, which is sort of what runs through a lot of what I'm talking about, that those communities, in building those communities, we had to be attentive to the kind of place-based genealogies, narratives, and practices, experiences, right, that brought us together and divided us. So I would say that place-based narratives, place-based analysis is another way of talking about what we used to call contextual analysis. But in this context, I think we are in fact talking about a conjuncture of history, genealogy, geography, culture, symbolic imagination, a lot of different things that come together. And we now, I think, have the analytic concepts that allow us to think in those ways. And I think that if we didn't pay attention to the kind of place-based genealogies and narratives that our comrades come to us with and understand those, it would be almost impossible to not think about questions of solidarity and coalition as non-colonialist. I think it is not possible to do that. So in other words, one of the things that I've understood over many decades, and this has really to do with always being in community with people who don't carry the same history that I do, always being in that community and finding that that community is crucial for me to understand my own self and my own history, right? As one of the things I've always understood is that in order to create ethical solidarities, which are more than just lip service, one has to become fluent in each other's histories. One has to try that. And that is really the kind of knowledge that place-based thinking offers us. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, very much so. The understanding for a particular way of paying attention to your own histories and trying to get a grip of that history. Yeah. A very weird moment happened a couple of years ago, 16, 17, I don't remember. I was doing a project on the US-Mexico border, mm-hmm. and a colleague of mine from Brownsville said, well, you, as a German, you have your own experience with borders, right? With walls. Yeah. And it was at the very moment that Trump said, I'm going to build this wall nonsense. Yeah. At the very moment I counted and I said, that was the exact time that the Berlin Wall had been down for exactly the same amount of years that it had been erected before.
Right.
It was a very strange coincidence in a very particular moment. I wanted to ask more about this notion of imperial democracy, which I have a hunch that I really like it because it is such a fitting description of my particular problem with, for instance, the Declaration of Human Rights. Mm-hmm. When we were doing the project, some people said, well, how can you be so critical of human rights? It's a good thing, isn't it? In the very same way that is a good thing to buy necklaces of people who do it. But at the very same time, it's too normative. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about imperial democracy with regard to human rights and other regimes.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is the idea of human rights. And in fact, the whole, the concept of women's rights as human rights that has been attributed to Hillary Clinton's speech at the UN Conference on Women in '95, which of course it wasn't. I mean, in fact, the idea was, floated by feminists in the global South for many, many decades before Hillary suddenly found it and used it. But in any case, I think that that formulation, women's rights as human rights, right, was a particular strategic move that was extremely important in terms of the UN itself, because it allowed feminists around the world, especially in the global south and in indigenous communities as well, to put the idea of violence against women in all kinds of contexts, wars, in a whole bunch of different things, trafficking, all of this, on the world stage, right? And lobby around that so that they could pressure their own government. So that, it works strategically in that way. So to me, that idea needs to be analyzed contextually in terms of its own history and what it allowed feminists in these different contexts to do. Okay, the idea of human rights itself and the idea of putting that together with this idea of imperial democracy, right? So what am I saying when I'm saying imperial democracy? I'm actually saying that in a lot of contexts, democracies, the way they are practiced, and I'm talking not just Western democracies, now I'm talking India too, right? So the way democracy is practiced is by generating and structuring the rights of citizens within national borders as what is called democratic rights, right? But never, in fact, paying attention to the fact that in order for those to be practiced, they are actually they have to be understood and connected to imperial projects outside the borders. So one thing I want to say about this idea of imperial democracy is that you can't understand most democracies without bringing the question of colonialism and imperialism front and center. How does a state that calls itself democratic within its national borders, right, behave as an empire outside its borders? So that's the one thing. To take that idea then to the idea of rights, right? I think that it's very difficult to talk about human rights if you don't raise the question of inequity and justice. Okay, so, and that's when I think the idea of place-based analysis and of utilizing what are seen as universal sort of desires or constructs, need to be substantially grounded in particular contexts. So on the one hand, we can't anymore say that we disagree with human rights. You can't say that, right? You don't want to say that. On the other hand, you want to be able to, again, contextually understand what is it that human rights consist of within a particular space, and what are we making visible, and what is it that is made invisible by understanding the question of human rights a certain way. So I think it's a complicated question, and I think that we need to be constantly rethinking it depending on what it is that we're trying to do on the ground, and what kinds of questions of justice are facing us at that moment.
And it's also the notion of bringing human rights someplace else that I kind of struggle with. You bring a blessing someone else. So, well, why not ask those who are supposed to be blessed?
Yeah. But I mean, you can't, it's like human rights cannot be a gift. You don't give the gift of human rights. People fight for it. That's the way we achieve that.
Mm-hmm. There are lots of questions and topics from the students. You talked, what would be a way of changing the way it is, some students ask. They say, just forgetting about all the borders that exist would probably lead to a lack of control or other kind of turmoil. What's a way of keeping countries, quote unquote, secure while stopping dehumanizing and while stopping segregation?
Mm-hmm. It's a big question.
Yes.
I mean, if I knew the answer to that, my friend, I, would be in a much more powerful position than I'm in right now. But I guess what I would say is, since the 1940s and since post-World War, we are living in a space that is governed by the United Nations and by nation states and nation state borders. So this means to me that, while we have to pay very close attention to how borders are enforced by particular states and regimes, right? And always think about how questions of citizenship, right, which are always connected to borders, right? How they are being formulated and what communities are being left out here, and then struggle so that we are building and imagining more inclusive polities, right? I think that we also have to start paying attention to the fact that, many of the borders of nation states were very arbitrarily drawn, right? Think about, why do we have the sort of insurgency that we've had around with India, Pakistan, and Kashmir? Why? There you have the Brits. And why do we have Israel, Palestine? There also you have the Brits. So I guess what you do is we want to be able to understand how colonial legacies, right, determine how borders and nation states operate in the present moment. And we want to then ask the question, are the people inside borders all that different from the people outside borders? So for instance, an example of this is indigenous nations in the US. A lot of indigenous nations in the US cross many different state borders. There is an indigenous nation at the Texas-Mexico border whose land space is on both sides of the border. So they don't believe that the US is where the US borders actually are meaningful to them. So I guess what I would say is pay attention to the fact that there are a lot of communities, right, that in fact live across borders on both sides. And therefore, what we see as questions of security need to be rethought, right? Who is being kept secure? Who is being seen as a threat, and why, right? And I think that this might be a time when we start imagining. See, you cannot start from the top, and you can't start from how do we rethink the whole nation state, okay? I think I don't know how to do that. What you can do is you can start by building communities of resistance and communities of dissent that cross all these borders. And that's actually what I've been talking about throughout, is that we build our dissident communities, right? And through the building of those communities, we understand how questions of power and inequity and exploitation work, yeah, across all of our communities. And we develop then strategies for challenging those practices of the state. But that you have to begin where you are. I guess that's what I would say. You always begin where you are. You don't begin at the, or at least, I know other people and theorists and all these people do that. There are people who think at that level, but what interests me is actually thinking concretely about the materiality of our practice and our ideas, right? And that only comes from, in fact, creating and building communities and coalitions that allow us to ask questions about what is working and what is not working. I don't know if I answered your question, but this is the best answer I can do now. Yes.
There's also the fact that, you know, doing border or undoing border by those practices. I don't want to say that borders don't exist, even though they have been postponed repeatedly.
Right.
But we have across the US-Mexico border, which I probably know best among the borders you talked about. You have so many artistic communities that kind of have a cross-border picnic and
completely. Yeah, there's some really amazing collaborative work actually among artists in that venue, which I was lucky enough last year to visit and actually talk to people, you know, on both sides. I mean, actually cross and there's some amazing activist projects. I mean, and that is really what I find more inspiring, that people see. The thing is, it's much harder, I think, to, you know, sit in a library and theorize about this. It is actually people on the ground who are, in fact, have already done that work, yeah, of coalition and, you know, in fact, both crossing borders and making the borders irrelevant in their own lives, right? It's that work that we need to focus on, make visible, and then theorize, not the other way around.
True. There's several other questions from the students. Let's see. Student writes, you talked especially about the powerless. Do you see a certain type of behavior that enables cross-border solidarity, especially in relation to those who earn their living in the so-called informal sector and are nearly invisible?
Mm-hmm.
Do
I see? I'm sorry, ask the question again, please.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talked especially about the powerless.
Yes.
And a student says, do you see a certain type of behavior or practice maybe that enables cross-border solidarity, especially in relation to those who earn their living in the so-called informal sector and are nearly invisible?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And in fact, you know, I think that some of the, and this is, I find this interesting because, you know, the pandemic has in fact exposed what we are now calling essential workers, right? Which is a lot of women in the informal sector and a lot of women doing care work, right? And so suddenly, in at least where I am right now, we have discovered, you know, that domestic workers and documented and undocumented immigrant workers, women, are in fact essential workers, right? And that the work they do is, has been invisible, right? But now has become visible in a very crucial way. So I guess I would say that there is a space for organizing that is very much a space for organizing that has been generated by, you know, undocumented and immigrant women workers, especially, I would say, right? And now I'm not talking about borders as in geopolitical borders. I'm now talking about, you know, living in a space where you don't have certain kind of citizenship rights, etc. But that there is a level of fierceness and organizing that has happened here that makes it very clear that the visibility of specifically women in the informal structure, sector is really, it's key to, in fact, the larger trade union kinds of women workers' struggles that are being theorized and sort of, you know, becoming important at this time. So yes, I mean, there is completely a place for this, also because of the new visibility, you know. So in some ways, it provides a certain kind of opportunity for understanding communities that have been invisible, but are no longer so. So for instance, a lot of the theorizing, I find some of the more interesting theorizing, feminist theorizing right now is happening around care work as it relates to undocumented and immigrant women workers, which you know, people have done case studies of this before, but this is actually much more visible. And we're talking also about like elder care. And I mean, there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of these categories that are sort of populated by workers who have really never been even counted among the kind of organizing that has happened, you know. So yes, I think that there is a lot of potential and there's a lot of work happening. I'm not as familiar as I would like to be with what is going on, but yeah, absolutely.
And the challenge probably is to keep that visibility in place and not to just let it go as the pandemic subsides.
Right, right, right.
There's a question from the general public. It seems to me there seems to be another border zone, namely that between the US and Canada, that tends to go under the radar in border studies. Would you be able to connect it to your scholarship? I am thinking particularly about the fact that there is perhaps no heavily militarized border space there.
Interesting, because there may not be a heavily militarized border space, but there's a whole history of Indigenous feminist struggle in Canada, First Nations feminist struggle in Canada, that has taken on the question of this, you know, what happens in First Nations context and how First Nations communities are being policed and erased and ignored at the same time. So I guess if I were to connect it, if I were to think more about it, the level at which I would connect it would be to think about how First Nations communities and struggle, the disappearance, murder of First Nations women, all of which are on front and center among Canadian anti-racist and Indigenous feminist scholars, right? So I would want to connect that to thinking about Indigenous struggles, Indigenous struggles in the US and in other sort of parts of the globe, right? In India, in Australia, Maori, in Hawaii. So I would want to try to map the connections between. So I wouldn't think about borders in the same way in this context, right? I wouldn't think about geopolitical borders. That, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that there are some real, I guess, in some ways, what I am trying to do is to describe what I feel are certain kinds of analytic and political and historical connections, right, that are a result of colonial legacies of various kinds all over the world, right? And to suggest that methodologically, these are the kinds of steps we might be able to take. So, so that borders means different things in different spaces. And I was thinking about borders and bridges, because bridges, and I really do feel you make, I mean, it really hit me reading Gloria Anzaldúa, bridges, there are no bridges. You make it by walking. Well, how do you walk? On what ground do you walk? How do you understand the ground you walk on? Who are you walking towards? I mean, there are all these questions, I think, that come up that are really important questions if we want to imagine, because right now there is a real need for inclusive and ethical political imagination of solidarity. I don't think that it's there to grasp easily in all the contexts that we live in. But I also think that struggles on the ground are doing some amazing work that was not happening, which is why I spent that time talking about, in a way, the difference for me between the Black Lives Matter organizing and the Black Power and civil rights organizing in the 60s and 70s. We are in a different space. We have learned certain things, right? And in learning those things, we start imagining relationships and communities on grounds that are different from the ones we've inherited, the racist, colonialist grounds, yeah, colonizing traces that we've inherited, and that sometimes we don't even know we need to decolonize ourselves from, in fact.
That is a very hopeful thing to say, that
we
have learned.
Yeah.
I hope we have learned, and that shows like from January 20th on.
Well, I hope so too. I mean, yeah. I mean, what we don't want to do, let me just say this. We have this amazing, this very diverse cabinet, right? Which is completely wonderful. But we don't want just represent it to stop at the representation of people. The work of representing is not the same as the work of justice, yeah, and undoing inequity. So that's what movements are necessary for. We're going to have to stay vigilant after 2020 as well.
Stay woke. There's, more questions. There, in regard to your perspective on military peacekeeping, there is a question from a student, and the student would like to know, what role do feelings of solidarity play in participation in military interventions as a woman?
Not sure I get that.
I'm not either. What role do feelings of solidarity play in participation in military interventions as a woman? Maybe female soldier, maybe female or peacekeeping?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
so
maybe that.
Maybe that's the question, yeah. So, to me, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, really. If you're a soldier in that context, you have to think in humane ways about what the heck you're doing. So, solidarity is because solidarity is something that is an achievement. It is not the same as all women empathize with each other because they're women. It doesn't work like that, because we have so many examples of women in leadership who have done the most abject things in their countries. So, I mean, I don't know how many of you are watching The Crown, but I'm thinking about Maggie Thatcher, for instance. It's just, so I think that oftentimes it's interesting because, I just finished teaching, and I had a student in my class who had retired from the military, and who really spoke in the most deep and poignant ways about reflecting back on what it meant to be in the military in Afghanistan, and the kinds of complicity, right, that she was called, and she was a translator. right? So she wasn't like on the front lines, but the level of complicity that was required of her, yeah, right now it's mind-boggling, because a lot of she's just re-evaluating all of this, right? And so I guess in that sense, I would say that, you know, what we're talking about is also a sort of the development of a feminist consciousness that allows us to think in different ways about the question of gender solidarity and what that means, right? That you end up, you have to complicate that idea that there is solidarity on the basis of being women, because, you know, there's class, there's race, there's ethnicity, there's ability, there's sexuality, there's all of these things that influence what it means to be a woman in different contexts, that are constitutively important in one's experience of gender.
Colleague is thinking about talking about the constitution-free zone at the border. And the reasoning goes a little bit like this. The border and like theories of bare life and so on at the border, if one happens to be from the other side of that border, the ones to be kept out, you basically take the border with you, even if you are an immigrant, and the border replicates in places like Santa Barbara, 300 miles away from the actual border, in terms of ghettos and citizen right and driving license, right, and whatnot. So in many ways, it's the constitution-free zone. If you think or you make yourself or you tell yourself it's only practiced at the border, it is never only practiced at the border. It's the whole country.
Absolutely, you carry it, and that's it. It's similar to the other point I made, which is that you know, it's not just that these ideas of documented subjectivities or the erasure of certain kinds of citizenship and constitutional rights works on the other side. It also influences us on this side. So it's not even that the people who are border crossers, carry the border. It is also that when they carry, we actually also have to address those questions. Those of us who may not have crossed borders to, in fact, be there. So no, I mean, it's not that constitution-free zones only occur outside, if that's the point your colleague is making. No, they occur inside. And that's why this connection between, you know, a carceral society. What is a carceral society? A carceral society, and a lot of us are calling for abolition right now. Why? Because, in fact, a carceral society really institutes constitution-free zones. Yeah, it's really about the policing, surveillance, disappearance, incarceration, deportation, right, of particular communities. And if the state does that with impunity, then we are talking about the state behaving in a constitution-free manner, as if it didn't matter. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. That's completely true.
The fact that we have at least 12, 13, 14 more questions gives me great pleasure, because it basically means that people are interested and people see the need to talk about these, to do things, to do border, undo border. But our time is more than up. And before we're shut off, let me hasten to add thank you so much. Thank you to all of you in front of your computer screens, wherever you are all over the world. And in more ways than one, thank you, Chandra, for taking the time to talk to and with us. And thank you also for your important scholarly and activist work. We will continue our Monday night conversations on solidarity with Professor Giovanna Corvi from the University of Trento in Italy on January 11th, 2021. Giovanna will be talking about the poetics of solidarity and mercy for practicing nonviolence. What remains for me is basically to wish you a good break, happy holidays, as happy as they can be under these circumstances. And above all, let's keep our fingers crossed for a better new year where solidarity is practiced and not just talked about. So thank you. Good night to everyone in this part of the world, and have a good day to all other parts of the world in different time zones. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, Chandra. Goodbye, everyone.